We're going to talk about multiplying and dividing rational expressions. But before we start, let's go ahead and do a quick review on factoring. So when I'm looking at factoring, what I want to do, if possible, is I want to factor out the GCF, which is your greatest common factor that I can divide both terms by. It's already in standard form, so we don't have to rearrange it. We can divide both of these by 8a. You typically want to look at the smallest number that's already given and try that number first. That's usually your GCF, your greatest common factor. So once I do that, I have 8a. That's what's going to go on the outside of my parentheses. And then what's left over after I divide? 8 divided by 8 is 1. And then a squared divided by a is simply 2 minus 1. So I'm still left with 1a. I take the sign that's in the middle. 16 divided by 8 is 2, and then a divided by itself is 1. So this is what my factored form would look like. 8a times a, the quantity of a plus 2. And if I wanted to make sure I'm doing it correctly, all I would have to do is just multiply back out, and I would end up right back where I started. So 8a times a is 8a squared, and 8a times 2, is 16a. So that's how you know you're on the right track. The next thing you want to look at is the restricted domain or excluded values. That simply means I cannot have a 0 in my denominator. So anytime I see a variable in my fraction in the denominator portion, I know I'm going to have an excluded value that I cannot use for a, or whatever the variable is. In this case, that excluded variable would be 0, because 8 times 0 would result in the denominator being 0, and we can't have that. That's called the restricted domain or excluded value. Another thing you have to be aware of is, since we're multiplying and dividing, when you're dividing, your second fraction is going to actually be a reciprocal. You have to take the reciprocal of it. So you'll see once we start working on the actual problems what I'm referring to. And then that division sign will turn into a multiplication sign. So example 1 is simply a multiplication problem. For me, the first thing that I like to do is go ahead, so that I won't forget, take out my excluded values. How do I do that? If I ever see a variable in my denominator, I know that I'm going to have an excluded value. Here, it's okay because it's 10. There's nothing that will make this turn into 0. Here, I can put in 9 over 5, and that will make this turn into 0. So we cannot have 9 over 5 as one of our options. That's an excluded value. Well, how did you get that? Well, the quickest way is to change the sign in front of your constant, which I did, and divide it by the number that's in front of your variable, which I did here. The other way is to simply set it up as 5v minus 9 equals 0, and then solve for v. Whatever v ends up being, which is going to end up being this, that's an excluded value. And then again, you take that 9 and you divide it by that 5. So back to actually simplifying. So now when I want to simplify, what I'm going to do is I am going to factor. That's why it's extremely important that you know how to factor. This cannot be factored. However, whenever I see a factor and I see something else that needs to be factored, 9 times out of 10, this is going to be one of the factors. If there's like 2 factors there, this is going to be part of it. So let's see if that's true. The greatest common factor between 45v and 81 would be 9. That simply means I'm going to divide both terms by 9. And then what I'm left with goes inside of the parentheses. So 9 times what will give me 45v? 5v. And then 9 times what will give me negative 81? Negative 9. What did I tell you? 9 times out of 10, that's what's going to happen. So that's good to know, because now I can start simplifying even further. So what I can do is diagonally, if something looks exactly the same, I can get rid of it. I can do the same from top to bottom. I cannot do the same if it's going across from each other. So again, diagonally, if they look exactly the same, I can get rid of it. I can simplify it. And top to bottom, I can do the exact same thing. So now I know it looks a little messy. However, what's left over is this 9, and the sign tells me to multiply it times 1. So I'm left with a 9. And then here at the bottom, 10 multiplied times, well, that just simply turns into 1. If you ever take something out, it just becomes 1. So 10 times 1 is 10. So this is my answer in simplified form. This is my simplified form. You will give me 2 answers, and this is the excluded value that I cannot use in the place of V. All right, let's try another one. And again, factoring is key. You have to learn how to factor. So I like this one because, well, anytime you see like 8x or 8x squared, once you set this equal to 0, you know that x is going to become 0. So your excluded values can be more than one thing. It cannot equal, so that's what that little slash means. I know it cannot equal 0 here. So now this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this in standard form, including the sign that's in front of the x. So I have negative 3x plus 7. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I see, I have a 3 and a negative 7. I also have, well, I have the same numbers, but the signs were different. So if I rewrite it, what I can do, if I remember the rules, is I can factor out that negative sign. And when I do that, I'm going to end up with negative 3x. And then once I divide 7 by negative 1, that becomes a negative 7. So again, I can get rid of that. When I'm doing that, up and down, I'm paying attention. Oh, there's one more thing I can get rid of. I can get rid of this 3x minus 7 and this 3x minus 7. Be careful not to forget that you have a negative sign here. That represents negative 1. Okay, so now we have this portion to actually factor. So what I want to do in this instance then is I am going to go ahead and I'm looking for 2 numbers that will multiply to give me 30, but those same 2 numbers will add to give me 13. Well, I know x squared is simply x times x. And just think about it. 10 times 3, right? 10 times 3 is 30, but when I add them, which means both signs will be positive, 10 plus 3, that gives me that 13x. Okay, so I can get rid of that. I am now left with the x plus 10 times x plus 3 all over. And again, I have to take into consideration there's a negative 1 right here. So if you need to rewrite this in a different color, highlight it, whatever you need to do so that you don't forget it, do that. Okay, and then I'm going to take that negative 1 and I'm going to multiply it times what's left at the bottom. So my final answer is going to be x plus 10 times x plus 3 all over. Now I can either put the negative here, but I prefer to put it out front. So negative 8x squared. That's going to be my answer in simplified form. Okay, so what I did not finish doing over here is I took out my excluded value over here, which was that 0, but I also had a variable here. So I can rewrite it so it looks easier so it's easier for you to figure out, or again, just set it equal to, let's just set that equal to 0. Because again, whatever would make this equal 0, we don't want it. That's an excluded value. So now what I'm going to do is move my constant, which means I have to subtract 7 on both sides. And I'm left with negative 3x equals negative 7. And now I would divide both sides by what's in front of my variable. So a negative divided by a negative turns into a positive. So I know I cannot have 7 over 3 as an option either. So these are my excluded values. And again, I can have more than one. So you're looking for your denominator, the original, before you start crossing out anything. You want to look for your original denominator, whatever would make that variable, make the denominator a 0. That's what you do not want. It's called the excluded value. All right, so let's try dividing. And it's similar. The only difference is before I can do anything, I have to make sure I take the reciprocal of the second fraction only and then change the sign to multiplication. So if I'm rewriting that, that's going to look like, I'm just going to keep the top part the same, 15p. You know what, let me leave some space because I know I'm going to have to factor. That is 15p plus 15 all over 9p squared plus 30p plus 21. Again, I'm changing this sign to a multiplication sign, and then I am going to take the reciprocal, which means that my numerator now becomes my denominator and my denominator now becomes my numerator. So this is what it would look like. Okay, so again, what I need to do is make sure that I look, well, I want to look for anything that would make my denominator 0. I definitely don't want that. So that's going to be an excluded value. So actually, it'll probably be better to factor it first and then go back and find that. So that's what we're going to do. In doing so, okay, 15p plus 15, I can divide both of those by 15. And I'm left with, so 15p divided by 15 is simply p, and 15 divided by itself is 1. Okay, now over here, I see 3p minus 7. Chances are that's going to be one of these factors, but I know I can divide all three of these terms by 3, so let me just do that first. And then I'm left with 3p squared plus 10p plus 7. And again, if you multiply it out, you will end up right back where you started. Can't do anything with this p minus 6. These are already factored as far as I can factor it. I can continue factoring this. So for those people who forgot how to factor, maybe you want to set up a box method and then try to factor that way. So the first term goes here. The last term goes here. And then you're trying to find two terms that will replace this 10p. So let's try the numbers they gave us. 3 times 7 is 21. 3 plus 7 is 10. So we're going to use the same 3, but we're going to put a p there, plus 7p. 7 plus 3p replaces that 10p. 7 times 3 is 21, which is what a times c is. So I know that these are the correct numbers. And now I just want to factor out my greatest common factor, 3p. And then here, my greatest common factor is 7. And now what I want to do is I want to, actually that should be a plus sign in my original problem. Okay, and now what I want to do is factor out the exact same way going towards the top. 3p squared and 7p, the only thing they have in common is a p, and then between 3 and 7, the only thing they have in common is 1. So those are my factors. So I'm going to take this away and bring down my 3. So 3, and then these are my new factors, 3p plus 7 times p plus 1. And this gets very messy. So you have to pay attention to details. So let me just change colors again. So I have a p plus 1 in the numerator and the denominator, so I can get rid of that. I have a 3p plus 7 and another 3p plus 7 diagonally, so I can get rid of that. So going across, I'm left with, if you want to put a 1 there just so you can see it, that's fine. I'm left with 15 times 1, which gives me the answer of 15. And then at the bottom, I'm left with 3 times p minus 6. So 3 times p minus 6. And then I say, well, I can divide 15 and 3. When I divide it, my answer goes where the largest number is. So 15 divided by 3 is 5. And then I'm still left with, in the denominator, p minus 6. I can no longer simplify. So this is my final simplified answer. In terms of my Excluded values, I have to go back to my original problem. So in my original problem, if I set 3p plus 7 equal to 0, or do the quick way that I told you where you just change the sign in front of the constant and divide by 3, I know that x cannot be negative 7/3. When I factored out the bottom portion, I saw that I saw a p plus 1 here. We've already accounted for this one. So p plus 1, the opposite sign of plus 1 is going to be minus 1. So I know I can't have a negative 1 either. And again, set it equal to 0, solve for p if you're not sure what's going on. And then finally, on my other denominator, we already took into account this one. So if you're wondering, well, what happened to this? I took into account for that one. That's this one. And then this one, if I set it equal to 0 and solve for p, then I'm going to get a positive 6. These are the numbers that I cannot use. They are considered to be excluded values. And again, other terminology for excluded value is actually called restricted domain. Sorry about that. All right. Hope that helped you guys.